It's not that old that we've been labeled as the SDS, although it was not a spontaneous measure by any means. What happened was last summer there was a group of student activists that came together who had been active within their respective communities and active on their various interests for quite some time, and were really frustrated with not only how our society operates, but also how our educational institutes operate and how they perpetuate ideals that are very, very harmful in a lot of different ways. So there's been a lot of tactics that we've undertaken as a result of this as well. There's definitely been direct action tactics. I can remember about 2 years ago at the University of British Columbia there was a proposal to build a shopping mall in the middle of campus with a bus loop or an underground bus loop underneath and market-priced housing over top. As soon as that announcement was made, a bunch of students ran around with petitions and got about 4,500 signatures in about a week to oppose this development. But again, like, petitions aren't enough, although it did cause a stir. People went to Board of Governors meetings and so on and so forth. But what happened as a result of this petition was it eventually grew into a park. There was a park that was set up in September of this past school year in opposition to, again, the development proposal for the area. And this park was pretty interesting in the sense that it was an actual park. There was murals, there was grass, and I think some of the things that we really learned from that was, wow, taking up physical space really can make a difference in the sense that there was a lot of support generated from it, but there was also and of course there was a lot of controversy generated from it as well. I mean, lots of people weren't really used to seeing, number one, students take action, and also students taking action in this kind of a format. I mean, it was a park. There was people planting grass in a parking lot that grew. There was also picnic tables, and there was also a pretty big geodesic dome that came out of it, which has been affectionately known as the Democracy Dome. And I think what we're trying to do in that is we realize that there are a lot of problems that we're facing right now. But we need to not only work outside these systems, but we also need to take over these systems. And we need to do these in a productive and positive manner to implement the change that we really do want to see manifested in our own environments. And a lot of our efforts have been successful as a result of our actions. There will be no shopping mall in the center of the campus. There's going to be a student union building. This park had a pretty big impact, not only in terms of the effectiveness, but also in terms of how angry some people got to see students being active, but also students opposing these kinds of educational structures that were happening. Like, for example, on April 4th, when we had an open concert with local musicians coming out to play, there was a lot of security and police surveillance in the area, just kind of questioning what was going on in the area. And although they didn't actually go into the area, at least not initially, there was a lot of questions being raised as to what is this? This was a peaceful protest. 19 students were arrested. There were students that were taken from the crowd arbitrarily from the police, pulled from the crowd as bystanders, thrown in jail for 24 hours, and then released with criminal charges. These charges are still pending. A lot of these students are also international students. This will have a significant effect on their ability to travel across the border. It has a significant effect on their ability to complete their own education. There are restrictions on these students on their ability to attend their own campus right now. Not only in terms of the restrictions, there's the financial aspect as well. I mean, having gone through this process myself, it's really been an interesting ordeal in terms of the kind of forces that we're dealing with in terms of where is the justice if, as students, we're coming in having protested, but then we're faced with thousands of dollars worth of legal charges now, criminal charges, for having asserted our right for peaceful protest. Yeah, so I just wanted to mention that and thank you all for coming here tonight, and that I am really looking forward to hearing what Tom Hayden has to say. Thank you.
A specter is haunting our universities. the specter of a radical and militant nationally coordinated movement for student power. Those aren't my words. Those are words from an SDS member in 1967, Carl Davidson. The passage deliberately recalls the Communist Manifesto in its opening passage. A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. The specter of 1848 come to life in 68. In many ways, we don't want specters of the past. And it's much better to hear from an activist than a historian or a theorist, as was just shown by the SDS and Steph's account of our actions with the SDS. Bill Ayers, the weatherman now promoted in right-wing circles as the terrorist mastermind of Barack Obama, said that, quote, the myth of the 60s is that in many ways the myth of the 60s is in many ways an event to erase the 60s as such. In other words, the idea, the nostalgia, and the concept of the 60s today is in effect what prevents the practice of activism in the present. I think if we take this to its radical conclusion, we find, paradoxically, that the only way to experience the 1960s today will not be through its mythology, but by engaging in the present and by engaging in activism. But can there be an activism without specters, or without the past and its traditions? It seems it is in the nature of activist eagerness to insist that the only way forward is to explode out free from the past to create new conditions of possibility. This is why, in his address to Columbia University in May of 1960, Norman Brown wrote, "There is a hex on us through the specters in books and the authority of the past, and to exorcise those ghosts, exorcise, is the great work of magical self-liberation." But in fact, I propose that today the situation is completely reversed from when Norman Brown spoke in 1960. It is not liberating to exorcise and conjure away the ghosts of 68 or the past, nor is it even possible, although everywhere there's an attempt to do away with the radical spirit. President Sarkozy in France argues that 68 is today responsible for the crisis of values, and that the memory of 68 must be liquidated. Obama distances himself from the radical traditions that today make America more progressive than it was before the 60s. From careerists and anti-radicals in the NDP here in Canada to neoliberals and neoconservatives, there's an attempt to conjure away the spirit of 68, precisely at a time when the spirit of 68 should be revived. We should think historically in a moment that Frederick Jameson himself defines, I think correctly, as an age that has forgotten how to think historically in the first place. The inability to think historically, that is our postmodern condition today. But while people attempt to cast away the history of our radical past, named 68, the mass general strikes in Paris, the Prague resistance against Soviet bureaucracy, the feminist movement as a whole, anti-colonial struggles everywhere, while people try to forget those things, the movement lives on, I think, everywhere. You cannot conjure away that spirit. You cannot make the spirit go away, the spirit of what I would call the spirit of communism. I think by communism, I don't mean the party or the state. I think those concepts should be primarily brought as categories to be critiqued and questioned. But what I mean is the spirit of equality, or what we might call the communist hypothesis. The spirited insistence on human equality, dignity, human rights, rights to food, shelter, clean water, education, free press. It's also the true love of civic life, participation, democracy, or what Tom Hayden popularized in the Port Huron statement as participatory democracy. That is the spirit. And you essentially can't make that spirit go away. It won't go anywhere, and I think that what I'm calling the communist spirit, or the socialist spirit, or the human spirit, or whatever, I think is not going anywhere, and especially not in a time like ours. Today's conditions are absolutely absurd, of course. Liberalism has proven its total inability to provide the conditions for the dignity of all human beings in this world. There's war, there's poverty, and there's oppression amidst the wealth of the few, those who continue to control our lives without our participation. And for that reason, we must live through 68, at least one of its spirits.
Mr. Hayden's background is not a mystery to many of us. He is one of the founding members of the original SDS. He wrote the Port Huron Statement, a published copy of which is here today. He has been a state senator in California. He's worked in countless issues of reform in his full career. And we are so glad to have him here today. So I try to think of you, a Tom Hayden that I could see Nate and Steph, myself, and everyone at SDS-UBC in, a Tom Hayden that I could relate to. And I thought of you sitting nearly 4 decades ago in a courtroom in Chicago as a kid like us. And I thought of you as you sat near someone like Dave Dillinger, who had made his own name decades before. And I thought that maybe you felt something of the same kind of relationship that we feel with you today. And maybe you, like us, felt torn in 2 different directions. Because on one hand, we do have an obligation to the past. On the other hand, we do need to strike out on our own. Like you said, we are people of this generation. And we cannot let ourselves become bogged down by the legacy of that past, like Nate was talking about, by that specter. And at the same time, we must still realize that the past is rarely past. And that the system you fought is the same system we fight today. And that the bastards are still in charge. and so as long as that is the case, the ethos of your SDS remains strong and vital. And we find ourselves looking for continuity and trying to find a place for ourselves in that. And that continuity is not about just respecting tradition, and it's not about mythology, and it's not about just recognizing the achievements of the past, so they certainly deserve it. It's about realizing that your generation, and I see people of so many generations over the last while here today, that you all have a unique place in the struggle today. Because the faces that mask the ugliness of war and greed and hate have changed. The rhetoric has changed. And if we live only in our time, then we might be tempted to accept those faces and accept that rhetoric. And they might throw us a bone, and we might be tempted to accept it and be satisfied. But we need you to help remind us that they still have the rest of the skeleton still in the closet. And we need you to help us drag it out. So thank you so much for being here today, Tom.